Okay, we're live. Good morning. Let us begin by acknowledging that we are gathered today in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral, present, and future territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Today, we gather with the intent followed by the living peace and friendship treaties with respect, cooperation, and coexistence. We are all treaty people. I will call this second budget meeting of the Town of Mahone Bay Council of May 16, 2025 to order. I believe there are some agenda items we want to discuss the order of our agenda for this morning. So do we want to continue where we left off with the capital? Do we need to go back to the general budget account budget summary account? And 10:30, I'd like to move to the grants. So what is the desire of council?
And I could just take questions on the capital, but if that's the case, we might want to start with discussion and questions on the operating. I just wanted to, I know we were really cut off in terms of the capital last time.
Wouldn't break my heart for everyone to have a chance to kind of weigh in on their impressions on the operating budget. To see how it's kind of sitting with everybody.
Okay.
And then, you know, I had less concerns on the capital program, to be fair.
Yeah. Same. Okay, all right, so we will start with discussion on the budget. What did you call it? The monster? Anyway, and then we will try to make 10:30 our target for moving on to grants, and we'll see what comes in between. So may I have a motion for
Accept the agenda.
as we've
Happy to do that,
discussed,
Mayor. I'll second that.
and second by the deputy mayor. Thank you. All those in favor signify aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. The motion is carried. Thank you. So, do you want to take the lead in this, finance manager?
Yeah, so, okay, so we went over the operating budget in great detail last week, and I presume everyone had a chance to read it all on the weekend, mull over it. So, are there any questions? Any direct questions, overall thoughts, feelings?
I had, sorry, I didn't want to put in. I just had a thought, and it's more, I don't know what's the right label for it. It's more how we present some things going forward. Last week, we spoke quite a bit about bringing things in-house, right? And I know there's not a whole lot of appetite for making this building bigger. So if we are doing that in the budget, it would be really good to have, I don't want to add more work, but it would be very, I think, good for the public to have kind of a cost benefit analysis of, I forget which one you were talking about a couple last week that were, you know, contracting this or contracting that, we're gonna bring it in, right?
Yeah.
And it makes more sense so I think it would just be good if we added a note there for the public to say, it's being brought in-house because there's these cost savings or this efficiencies or this, you know, as opposed to just more meat on the bone kind of.
Yeah, no, that's a good, so we did, within the budget, but obviously it's buried in all the noise. It's that if, you know, if we're assuming that, vegetation will be taken care of more by Public Works, then we did reduce the vegetation budget, but yeah, to bring it out and just to know and have a little summary of that, I think would be.
Just so it's clear for the public that they see.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful.
You know, we're not just adding for adding sake, but it's,
Yeah, I mean, there's tangible and there's the intangible part too. I mean, I think bringing in house not only does it allows us to control the situation much better, I know.
sure.
Right, so it's, you know, I know you, sorry, did you?
No, CAO's just waiting, just.
Oh,
finish your
sorry, I
thought.
was just, I'm
No,
sorry.
no, and then I think Councilor Feeney.
Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes, you know, it bringing in house, it does seem like we're adding more salaries and all that stuff, but we're also adding control to the situation, so.
Right.
You know, I think we're all aware that relying on any third party at this point, it seems like everything after COVID is more difficult to contract, to hire, so we can certainly rely on our staff a lot more, which would be more of an intangible to it. But I think a cost analysis would be a great idea to just focus, here it is, here's how much it costs us, this is what we're, yeah,
And like that, maybe cost and benefits, right?
Yeah.
That'd be a good
absolutely.
addition.
CA.
Yeah, so anything in the staff changes in the budget, there are narratives, and what we talked about last time is after council's had sufficient opportunity to weigh in on whether those changes are gonna be in the budget, then those narratives will come out into the final document.
Great,
So I think that's, a great point, and we can workshop that, and then the final document will have those notes. But we don't usually put a lot of that in, because obviously it's not confirmed by council that that is the approach we will be taking.
perfect. So it's a end of process.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great.
Councillor Feeney.
So just a couple thoughts. On page 33, when we talked about the transfers to and from, so that page gave me a lot of pause. So specifically, the reliance on the deed transfer tax to be used for operating expenditures versus our historical use, which would have been capital expenditures. And so, like traditionally, we've had a very clean, clear first story around someone moves to town, they buy a house, they pay the deed transfer tax. The deed transfer tax goes into the maintenance and the construction of capital items. 2 years ago, with some direction from the province, they said, hey, you know what, your operating reserves are a little light and we would prefer if they'd be a little heavier. So Dylan made the recommendation, hey, listen, let's take $100,000 from the capital reserve and we'll journal it over to the operating reserve. And we did that for 2 years. Then in last year, without the really knowledge of the education amount that got adjusted year end, we took $175,000, I believe, of the deed transfer tax and reallocated it over. This year, we're just defaulting the budget as deed transfer tax is going to operating. So I know we're talking a lot about, comparisons, but essentially we're taking an 8-cent subsidy from deed transfer tax and reallocating it to operating expenses. And what that means is essentially our budget for operating expenses, the 111, it's just dramatically understated relative to the program that we have. So I'm not saying that I want to have a sweeping change back to the good old days, because I think that would require an 8-cent increase of tax rate to be able to get us back to where we were 3 years ago. But I do also have a problem with doing the whole 175. I feel more comfortable at $100,000 transfer than a $175,000 transfer. And for like people out in the street who think, well, what are these guys worried about? What's $75,000? Well, like, that's a few, that's 3.5 cents a tax rate. So, I mean, I think I'd prefer to say, if we defaulted on the transfer and made a decision amongst us all at the table about saying, okay, we'll take 100,000 of the deed transfer tax and we'll allocate that to operating. We'll pick a number that we're all, there's support for. But I think just the default that we're taking all the deed transfer tax and firing it over into operating, because what happens a year from now or 2 years from now or 3 years from now if we don't hit the number? Two, and the other thing is traditionally our $175,000 always had a 3-for-1 leverage, because every dollar we have on capital gets us $2 extra of federal and provincial grants. So I'm a little worried about how we've understated our expenses and overstated, our ability to fund our capital projects. So anyway, that was the first thought about. I'm not sure what everyone else thought about that, but
And wouldn't there then be a risk as well of going from 111 to like 125 at one point or something, a big leap in the future because we have to?
So I made this point the other day, Deputy Mayor, about, I just wonder, are the service levels so there's lots of different ways to tackle this. We're not talking about a monumental amount of money, but is the operating budget lean enough to everyone's satisfaction? So we're basically funding everything on operating and saying, don't worry, we by legislation have to have a balanced budget. So make it as much as we want. We have to fund it, and like we did last year. So we would have thought last year we were going to have a pretty solid operating surplus. that we ended up having a balanced budget. But it was only because we took all the money for the deed transfer tax and reallocated it over to expense. I just wouldn't want to make that a habit. I guess that's the point I'm making.
Yeah, most municipalities have obviously confronted rising costs with tax increases over the last number of years. We've been substantially buoyed by deed transfer, but that, as Joe said, should be traditionally socked away for capital. That's the great practice that we have had. And having not put up taxes, we come to be more reliant on that.
The other observation I make while I'm on a roll, and I'll be trying to be brief, is when you look at the fire allocation, and I'm as guilty of this as anybody. So this is I was part of the original mistake. When we divided the original budget, the original rate into two components, fire and town general, and we split it. We split fire. We didn't prorate the fire by category. We just split it and gave all categories the same number, which was the 22.5 cents. So if you traditionally, when you had commercial paying 30% of the overall pie of contributions towards the town, notionally they were also paying 30% towards fire, 30% towards town general, 30%. When we split it, it got bifurcated, and now it's really now it's 90% of fires paid by residential and only 10% of fires paid by commercial. So like we have an imbalance because we gave commercial the same rate as we gave residential, and we didn't give them and of course their assessments are low relative to the methodologies to do the assessments because it's income based, not market based, like it is for residential. So I think to myself, we've added a lot of fire infrastructure to support the senior citizens facility or the McLeod group, the churches and I think it's been a net benefit. But I'm just wondering if the split of the burden is fair. And what you all think about that.
Well, and I think the donation is down that we were expecting from the nursing home, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I
There's
mean,
more-
in the sense that donations as a share of the department's costs don't make up nearly what they used to either.
Yeah.
And corporate side isn't coming through the way they might once have, certainly, yeah.
Yeah, I guess I've always struggled to understand why it is considered to be fair to have commercial enterprises pay roughly triple the tax that residential people pay, considering that in general they use the same services. So, I mean, that's historical here, that's even worse in other towns for sure. But I've never understood the logic.
Yeah, it's a function of assessments, right? So two houses across the street, one's residential, one's commercial, they're probably similar market value. This one's a third of that one as far as assessment. That's the reason, yeah.
The assessment,
The assessment's different.
or the rate's different.
No, the assessment's different. The PDFC assessment for commercial uses a different methodology
Okay,
than
for
residential.
sure, okay, but the rate is
Our rate is different.
three something,
Yeah.
commercial,
Yeah.
about 11 for the
But
residential.
Joe's saying that's inverse to the way that the methodology calculates
Yeah.
the value, so they.
Yeah, I understand, so,
Yeah.
so we're saying that balances out, more or less?
Well, I mean, so commercial now is paying 24% of the pie. I mean, when it first joined council, it was 35%. When you first joined council, it was 40%. At the apex of COVID, it was down to 18%. So I don't know, 25% seems about right. So I'm not losing a lot of sleep over the commercial tax rate per se, as it relates. But I'm a little perplexed about the contribution on the fire rate. The fire rate seems low, but the commercial rate seems about in balance if you stay at $1.11.
When I looked at those at those numbers, I puzzled over them and invented the rationale that the imbalance is because the commercial properties are mainly in town. So it's the Mater's Cove.
No, I'm sorry,
Something to do with
I'm
that.
just talking about town revenue, not the revenue from the other regions. So if you just, I think it's on page 1 or 2, isn't it, Ashley,
Yeah.
where you talk about the total prorated percentage?
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm not sure, no one has any, it just seems like we have a mathematical error or flaw in the calculation of the fair split on fire. And I just wonder if anybody wants to do anything to solve, to address that.
Well,
Councillor Paulson.
It seems to me that what they're saying is that the taxes are higher for commercial, but lower for fire, so isn't that the offset in part?
No,
In other words, if you're paying more for your commercial property in taxes,
you're not paying more. You're paying, the calculation is using a higher rate on a lower assessment value. So if you have two similarly valued buildings, one's commercial and one's residential, and they're right next to each other, like the two buildings across the street that we're looking at at the town council, the one building is materially lower. The assessed value using the income assessment methodology from the PDSC gives you a different calculation. That's why that's why the residential buildings are assessed high, and a lot of the commercial buildings have lower assessments. And so it's a lower assessment, so it needs to be a higher rate for everyone to pay a fair amount. And I think generally the ratio is similar to every other municipality in the province. What I'm getting at here is in a separate and distinct matter, going back to the original split of fire, and it wasn't, to be frank, it wasn't a big deal, because it wasn't as big a deal because the dollars were less material. But now we're in a situation where commercial's only paying for 10% of fire and residential is paying 90% of fire. And traditionally it was a 66-33%, for example. And now it's 90-10. So all I'm suggesting is that I don't think there's a lot of support for a tax rate increase on commercial. Fair enough. But I do think that if we were going to make an adjustment on fire rate, that's just math. Like, that's just a logical observation. And we would try to, over a multi-year period, you'd phase in slightly higher fire rates for commercial. And remember, commercial is what's driving our requirement for this fancy equipment, not necessarily residential. Like, there's a reason we have a aerial truck. It's because, when your father was married, you didn't need an aerial truck, right? Nor mine. But now you need one. Now you need one. So and it's not because of a 2-story building on Pleasant Street. It's because of a 4-story building at the back of town. Anyway, preaching to the converted. I'm just saying it wouldn't break my heart to have more money in fire and to have us take a look at that.
Two rates almost as we do for our general tax, like a commercial rate for fire and a residential rate for fire.
That was my thought. Now remember, a 5-cent increase. So a 5-cent increase for commercial is $12,000. Like, this isn't a sweeping, oh, now we can go out and buy a new pumper. I'm just saying, like, over a 3 or 4 year period, we start working towards something that is more logical sense. We're really just, a council down the road can figure out if it's the right number, but we need to make some incremental steps forward.
Councillor Plummer?
Right, if it's not actually worth that much, businesses in town are already like not too happy and we want to support them. So if it's not that big of a difference, and it's only $12,000.
Well, the 12,000 is going to get spent. It's just who pays. And if the commercial folks don't think a 90-10 split's fair, well, then we can keep it that way. It's just going to be people on fixed income on Pleasant Street paying a little bit more and commercial business is paying a little bit less. I mean, it's the money will get spent because the program's set in stone and we're making big investments. So what I was saying is it's not really about the $12,000 this year. It's really around the way that compounds over and would get adjusted over time into a more logical number. I'm not sure what the fair number is. Maybe 80-20 is fair. Maybe 70-30 is not fair anymore. Maybe 60-40 is not fair the way it was 10 years ago. But 90-10 doesn't strike me as fair anymore.
And what do you?
Sorry, folks. Anyway, those are kind of my two thoughts.
As HRM does what Joe was talking about, all of the rates have a commercial and residential to keep the ratio the same, whether it's fire or they have a lot of different rates. Many units don't make the distinction, but it is possible.
it makes sense to me. I mean, essentially equity we're talking about. between the two groups?
Well, I think, we had $25,000 in training for fire this year. We've got a lot of investments in both in equipment, but also in personnel. And that needs to get financed. And, and I think, while we have a fair rate between ourselves and the resident in the region, lots of people from the region are looking at that number and wanting to make sure that number is fair too. All I'm saying is that we need to do the town writ large overall needs to pull our own weight here, because we're getting a lot of revenue from the municipality areas too. And we need to be advocates to make sure that they're only paying their fair share too.
Is this about raising, sorry,
Continue, and then just the manager.
is this about raising more money or raising fire in order to reduce residential to end up with the same number?
So that's a fair question, Brian. Maybe we can take another look at the fire budget, but I was thinking we increased the fire budget by 0.5 cent last year. We're increasing the fire rate by 0.5 cent this year. My sense of things, we'll have to raise the fire rate by 0.5 cent next year. So, this is, I doubt the extra $12,000 will lead to any tax cut, but I think it would help us get towards appropriately funding the fire department service. Anyway, those are just a couple thoughts I had.
We have the manager and then.
Just a quick question, for the outside revenue source, would we also break it for that, or would that just continue
Well,
to be
I mean,
a flat rate?
do we enjoy any commercial revenue from the region?
Probably not, but who knows? I don't know.
The CAO can speak.
Yeah, so we don't, just to that question, then I'll go back to what I was originally gonna say. We don't necessarily have the ability to impose that. MODL doesn't have just distinguished rates. So I don't think we do have the ability to impose that. If we're talking about a fire service agreement with MODL, as we generally expect to be talking about, that's something that if we've done it in town, we could then say, well, we do feel it should be approved. There definitely is, some commercial assessment, but most of the commercial assessment we end up responding to is actually mutual aid. Like in the immediate nearby areas, there's a substantial increase of not serviced commercial development, right? In Martins River, Blockhouse, places that actually require pretty substantial investment in fire service. And we pretty much are always providing mutual aid in Martins River, where there's new commercial constructions are going in. So there is definitely a point about maybe in the long run, that structure would benefit MODL as well, even something to think about. What I was originally going to point to was just a quick comment on why we might need more revenue in fire, just to make sure anybody watching understands. We are purchasing another brand new truck to replace an older truck that's going out of service. That truck will arrive this summer, and then as of next year, the payments on that truck will begin. And so we don't have that in the current fire budget. So we do have an expectation so that we're going to need a revenue increase next year. So if you do rectify this issue, that's putting it a little bit ahead of the coming need to finance that fire truck.
But we have to buy that fire truck this year.
Yeah, but that's not, so it's being borrowed from debt, so like we don't pay for it this year. The next year's budget will reflect the payments.
Yeah, and who knows what a fire truck will cost in 7 or 8 years.
Yeah, those are the best guesses in the long-term budget, but I expect it to be low.
When we first did the first review, it was 800 grand, and this is coming in twice that.
Councilor Carr?
So this wasn't my question, but am I right in thinking that the new fire truck is required by the underwriters? Is that?
Yeah, and basically it's giving us 20 years with that as a, brand new top line. Whereas most of our truck purchases that have been used are not going to be good for 20 years according to the underwriters.
But that's important to know, that we're meeting standards.
And that will complete essentially truck purchases for the better part of the next decade. Like we're in good shape with that truck.
So my
Yes.
real question, I had 2 questions. One was about the fire rate. How is the rate established for the outside ratepayers?
Negotiated.
Well, I mean, so right now we follow the process that MODL established for most of their volunteer departments, which is that we submit to them annually what our expectation of a rate would be. And then that is applied to Clearland and Oakland. Maynard's Cove does have a commission, so they are to approve that rate increase, and MODL then applies it in their territory. So it is very timely right now, is that like we actually do need to be notifying people. The AGM for Mayor's Cove is in early June, I think,
Mhm.
and we want this on the radar. Yeah, and then so MODL's council approves those rates that have come from all throughout their territory.
And we have yet to develop a clear agreement with Modal, is that right?
Yeah, so for those areas that don't have a commission and
Yeah.
likely Mayor's Cove Commission in the long run may not, be able to sustain itself just in terms of turnover and membership. Then it would allow the town to have a more stable, long-term understanding of how our future spending is gonna influence rates, and there's no real question that those rates will be validated through that agreement.
Thank you. So my number one question was on a
Yes.
different topic, so on page 16, under the legislative items. And the remuneration, the mayor's remuneration is listed as 18,000. And I believe it's more than that, so there's a portions of the salaries that were the remuneration hidden somewhere else in other categories.
No, I don't think we have that. I don't think council as a whole is allocated to any other, so let me just double check.
Some of them might be split with electrical, maybe? Is there a prorated piece of that?
We shouldn't have any council. Although, you're
But the mayor,
costing more than we should.
what is for the public, for everybody, for me, I can't remember what the level of remuneration is for the mayor.
Yeah, I'm going there.
And I think it's an item of public interest.
I think that's prorated, actually.
I'm just gonna double check, so we have a
80-20?
pretty intense spreadsheet where we allocate everything, and I can't. Let me check out council.
Yeah, I think it's certainly right in terms of the raw math of the remuneration policy.
So, yeah, so it goes between. Yeah, electric, water,
Yeah, we split it, right?
yeah,
Yeah,
electric, water, and general.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, the actual total should be 29,136.
yeah, so that would be, so it's in electric and water, which we have reviewed it. It would-
60% general, 20 over
Yeah.
to the other.
Yeah, it would be within,
The same as mine or actually,
yeah,
Right, so that's what I thought, but I think it would be useful to explain that somewhere and actually put in the absolute numbers somewhere.
Well, maybe
I don't know.
that applies to, we were gonna do with staff, so it's kind of doing the same thing with council is ensuring that there's a number that says stuff is spread out so that you
Yeah.
can.
yeah, okay,
But I also think it would be useful to have the absolute number for the salary number, the remuneration numbers for council.
for
I
council,
think that's useful public information.
Yeah, and as you may recall, at the last meeting, I suggested we should have a similar list for staff. Not necessarily by name, but by position.
yeah, so you'll see that in our closed session today, we do have something for staff specifically, and then council can decide how they want to.
Yeah,
roll
the
that
final,
out
I
to
guess we
public.
usually just try to say the final version, once council has
Yeah.
reviewed, will reflect what's actually in the final document.
Right.
But we don't put the drafts out there, we don't need, especially the staff people, wondering what their conversations being debated, so.
Counselor Wilson?
Yeah, I just, in the spirit of making comments, I haven't had a chance to look at this yet, but I'm assuming that the changes recommended in this document are reflected in the budget.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So my concern has been for some time that in certain areas where we're a little bit light in terms of expertise, and I'm thinking particularly of the problems we've had with getting the province on the side with all these numbers that they want. And I didn't read it all, but I think that's being addressed here. But I did want to mention, it's roughly a 10% increase year over year of the budget. Fair enough. That's should be enough money to address the concerns, I hope. But one of the things that I don't know how to address it, but this whole business of retention is worrisome. And I'm outside looking in, so I don't really know. But my sense is At least recently, our retention problems, and I know we're not in closed session, but I think we really need to address how we recruit people and make sure we're getting who we need at the beginning, rather than try to fix it later. I guess that's the place we can put it in open session.
Okay, no questions? And
So-
oh, Councilor Phelan?
Just the final thing, so it wouldn't break my heart if staff tried to take the budget back, the operating budget back. Like, I'd feel a lot more comfortable with a fixed number below 175 coming from de-transfer tax. Like, Hope Springs Eternal will have $500,000 in de-transfer tax. I hope every house with a for sale sign sells. But I think we shouldn't get used to that crutch, and it wouldn't break my heart to see us start clawing that back.
And I support that, and it makes sense. I'm sorry, I didn't break my turn.
Councilor Carver?
In terms of oversight as well, and if we all know that the amount is 100, then we can all, or the rest easy.
Or, I mean, so there's only so much blood from a stone, CAO, like, I'm not saying you're gonna magically conjure up savings. But I wonder if we couldn't get your best opinion on some economies that could be found in the next version that would reduce the requirement to take the 175 down to a lower number. I'm not looking for perfection, but I just think one extra effort to try to see what we could do there. If we, believe me, and you've all heard me rant on this before, I'd be happy to take de-transfer tax to 3% if we were legislatively allowed, but we're not. So we're the first town in the province to have de-transfer tax. We've gone from, 1 to 1.25 to 1.5. Thank God we did. We've had, several $1 million of de-transfer tax has been raised in the last 10 years. And we need every nickel of it. But I just think we need every nickel of it for capital, not for operating.
Right. Councilor Paulson?
Oh, I think it's essentially reflected in Councillor Feeney's comment was transferring out of operating means you've got to cut operating in some way or other.
Right.
So I don't know if it's possible, Dylan. If it's not, fair enough.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I want to say is how we approach it. So I do think that it's very clear the long-term trends show that, we are underfunding the operating reserve as it stands.
Yeah.
And the current budget draft, which obviously will show changes, projects a very low balance on the operating budget at the end of the year, or the operating reserve at the end of the year. Capital reserves variously, some of them pretty well funded, the total amount of reserve there being over 2 million, not bad, but the operating part really getting tight. So, I do think that ultimately we're gonna have to confront not only looking for reductions in costs, this is always a good idea to do, but whether there should be some more predictable expectation from the public around their role in paying for the same increase that we experience in every other facet of our lives, right? We had a 1.72% increase in assessment.
Yeah.
But a 2.4% increase in cost of living. So ultimately, your assessment actually, relatively speaking, fell relative to everything else you pay in your life.
Yeah.
So, at the end of the day, that trend is not sustainable. But that being said, I think it's a great suggestion, obviously, to look for opportunities for savings. What I want to talk about is how we may do that. So there's sort of an assumption from staff that, everything that is status quo, like our partnerships and commitments, would continue. And so for the most part, that leaves us with very little that we can, move on within the budget. We could have a discussion, I think it would probably be in closed session with respect to contract negotiations, about some of these areas that maybe are not a great way to use our money. But it's something that I think requires not just a tweaking around the margins, but some real consideration about how we go about certain things. So that may be a discussion that we'll have to have in this budget process. And I would say, I don't think the last several years, we've really questioned some of those basic assumptions about how we're delivering our services.
Councilor Carver?
Could the CIO repeat those percentages again, the cost of just those numbers?
Yeah, so in the budget, when you get the breakdown of the change in assessment numbers, there's a 1.72 growth in general residential assessment.
Where do we find that on page?
Yes, I do have the page number, it's on page 9.
It's the cap,
Page 9.
it's the cap rate, right?
Yeah, this is fine according to this. So, yeah, and obviously the way that falls, you know, properties coming out from the cap, not, you know, there's something to consider, but if you are living in your home and nothing's changed, you didn't buy the home this year, 1.72% is the average increase in, basically the value of your home, which you're then taxed on. And with no change in the tax rate, 1.72% is the amount more that you're likely to pay. Now, that's different for every property based on the cap. I can't, you know, but in comparison to that, we're looking at a cost of living increase, like based on our staff, of 2.4% using CPI. So relatively speaking, the cost of living increased more than the percentage of that you spend on your property tax bill for somebody who stayed in the same homes they were in the year before. I just think it's worth knowing that, you know, we are actually in consideration, I think, of the general challenge people are having with the increasing cost of living. Relatively speaking, the share of their income going to property tax is decreasing in this budget and has been decreasing.
Yeah.
So I understand everybody's paying a lot more every year, and I get that. I'm not unsympathetic to that. I just think people should understand, we've been
Our
really
challenges.
tightening our belt in order to not burden the community. Relatively speaking, we burden them less than we did last year.
And that's on page 7, not on page 9,
Yes.
so.
That map, like, I agree with that map totally.
Oh, sorry, so that's why I think it's a version issue, because I have 9 in front of me.
Oh, okay.
I do think though, a lot, like an exercise of just a cost cutting or efficient, like just a second look is what we owe the residents, because over and above their property taxes, there's all sorts of external cost of living and challenges and pressures that they want us to be attentive to, so.
Yeah,
And that, another session on that would be good, I think. Or
you had your hand up
Yeah, you
before,
had
so
your-
you go with manager.
I was just gonna say, it would be helpful for a direction on a percentage or a dollar value to cost cut, because for us, this is the bare bones to make a balance. So if we're, without increasing the revenue, if we're gonna decrease the expenses.
Well, that's why I say we have to come with solutions that are.
Yeah, we need
A significant change of direction in a particular
I think
area.
so.
So that way, there are potential savings, but,
Yeah.
you know, looking at the thing and just saying, cut it down isn't
Yeah, no,
necessarily realistic.
more
But there
strategic.
are some bigger picture things, and I just, the reason I had my hand up was just to note, it may not be something that this year, like what we may end up with is a strategy around how to reduce costs over the term to parallel the increasing need for capital funding. It will not be, because these are contracted things for the most part, that we're necessarily able to make a big shift in this year's budget. But if we end up with a strategy around that we can start implementing, then that will avoid the same challenge coming next year. So we'll have the conversation, we'll see where council wants to go with them.
So Mayor, like, this is the art of the budget. This conversation we're having right now, like, this is the guts of why we come together for 16 hours. You know, so policing's up 6%. Policing's up, you know, we need 2 cents on the tax rate just to pay for the increased policing. So when policing's up 6%, and I'm sure education's up a similar amount. And, you know, it's difficult to live within an overall assessment increase capped at 1.6. So, you know, you all heard the rant many times about how abhorrent a policy the cap is, but this is the reason. So we need an assembly line of real estate transactions to keep the train running. And if the real estate transactions ever slow down or stop, or heaven forbid, we have ever a recession, or heaven forbid, for whatever reason, no one buys real estate here in this region for 2 years and there's a downdraft, we will feel pain because we now entirely relying on the D-transfer tax for operating. Before it was just a windfall of good news. We'll take this, put it in reserve, we'll do some sidewalks. Now we need it to pay the day-to-day. And that's a new thing. That isn't a historical thing. What it leads us to is the conclusion that 111 is not sustainable. And we need to be realists with ourselves to think how much longer we can live at 111. I have my doubts, how much longer we can go.
May I ask you a question? When you talk about the transfer, a certain commitment to the capital line, so You're just saying if we brought in 500,000 in deed transfer, say, you're still saying only a certain percentage goes into, is it a
Well,
percentage you're looking for?
Well,
or-
last year we had a 175 D transfer budget, and we had a decision by council to take 100,000 and allocate it over to operating. Fair enough. Eyes wide open, we all made that call, and we did a similar thing the year before. But we brought in 300. We brought in
So
300.
where's the rest of that? money?
Well, it's in capital reserves.
And then, so that is an important consideration in terms of the way we presented this, like, to simplify it, you could obviously just take the 175 in, 175 out of the budget entirely and say deed transfer revenue goes to operating. But because we've always had the convention that deed transfer revenue goes to capital, we take a certain portion and say, this much
Right.
is needed into operating. Anything more than that should go into capital.
Like, remember
That,
the,
like, so there is an intention to
the-
continue the practice of taking deed
Oh,
transfer to
the
capital.
debt is financed through the capital funds, not through operating funds. Like, so the debt servicing load, there needs to be sufficient money in capital to finance, to pay all the interest and principal payments. So when we look at the 111, like all, the debt schedule that was elegantly crafted on one of the earlier pages, Ashley, like none of those financing costs are borne by the 111. They're entirely borne by the capital contributions and traditionally deed transfer tax. So we're going from deed transfer tax was paying colloquially with all the debt servicing. Now we're taking and moving it operating. Like, I don't think that's a good idea.
Yeah.
I think we've done ourselves a huge favor by financing our debt the way we have. And then keeping because, Councilor Wilson's been at the table many years. It's the only way we can constrain expenses. So you're essentially capping expenses because you're really keeping it tight and low, and that's,
Right.
but we're running up against, so we got two problems.
Yeah.
We have problem number one is we've got higher expenditures, day-to-day operating expenses that we're running up against the 111.
Yeah.
I'd suggest to fully fund it the way we did 3 years ago, it would need to be $1.16. Right? We need another $75,000 in revenue, right? No one wants to do that. No one wants a 5% tax increase. So, okay, let's eyes wide open defer that decision if we can. But on the other hand, we need the money to fund the debt because we've got another bunch of debt that we're layering in that we also need to fund. And we can only fund that through these capital sources, or we have to increase the assessments of the tax rate to fund the debt, and I don't think we want to do that either.
Councilor Carver.
I'm gonna ask a dangerous question. What's the risk of doing that, of increasing the tax rate?
Well, risk is,
Phone calls,
man, what are you
emails,
gonna do?
more attendance.
But
maybe.
it's reality
It's
based.
gonna, the taxes are going to go up. It's just, are we gonna put them up this year or next year or the year after that? I mean, inevitably, they will push higher. It's just a mathematical certainty. And it's why we have a 75-cent gap with Bridgewater right now.
And it's why we have instituted the property tax rebate policy in practice, which is not being well taken up.
The low income rebate,
Mhm.
low income rebate.
Low
Yes.
income, yeah.
So it's probably better to increase.
But
the
I mentioned that, sorry, Rebecca, I'm just mentioning that because those are the people who are gonna be most affected, people on low income. Sorry.
Councilor Carver.
No, I was
Or
just thinking that, I think probably, well, I would anyway, I would prefer for my bill to gradually increase rather than, a year or two later, it's all, boom.
And that's what we did with the
Yeah.
power rates.
Yeah.
They stayed the same for so long and then boom, we had no choice but to raise it. And we did hear that outcry from the
Yeah.
public, and rightfully so. It was shocking.
And with the water and electrical, to be fair, we have to lay the blame for that on the regulatory process, which essentially incentivizes big hits periodically over stable gradual increase.
Because of the cost.
Because of the cost
Yeah.
of setting rates. So we would be far better off, since we do control the tax rate, taking that approach of incremental change because we can. Whereas with utility rates, we actually can't. We're not allowed to, even though we do know we should be.
Councilor Wilson.
Excuse me, one of the things that's puzzled me is I think, and maybe I'm a bit wrong about this, but I think most municipalities take all of this money and put it straight into operating general. So doesn't matter what it is, gas tax, transfer tax, it all just goes into one account. And then when you need money and when you do it at the budget process, you say, I need $600,000 to fund capital this year. You transfer that out into some kind of a reserve fund and get on with your life. But we have built this construct, I'm not saying good or bad, that when we've taken gas tax and all these other little dribs and drabs of money and put them into a separate fund and said, that's for capital and this isn't. And I'm just wondering if that, what we're doing is the wisest thing to do in terms of how we structure our finances more generally. Or would we be better off to dump it all into general and then say what we need for the year and move it out, but we're done.
Except for reserves. We
So
still.
it would go
build
into the
on-
reserve, and you build, and you fund the reserves any way you like, that's a policy decision. I don't know, it seems to me that the way we do it is a bit complicated and unnecessary, so.
Is it?
I don't know how other municipalities are doing it per se, but it's certainly not the most straightforward, but I think the intent is to hedge any future expenses. But, you know, if we put it all in one and then allocate it out at the time of the budget, I assume that's what you mean, and then we know where everything is for that year, and then you zero the reserve at the end of the year, because we spent it or we haven't, and you put it back in operating.
Yeah.
That would-
Yeah, well, like, for example, we don't do capital out of revenue so much as we have a dedicated funding to capital and pull from those funds for
Exactly.
capital in current year.
Yeah.
So in practice, what you actually do is much like what Councilor Wilson is suggesting, we don't actually move the funds out, we net it all out at the end of the year, and only the difference goes into reserves, right? So the
Right.
reserves get the. So we show a lot more of the, like how the budget is made, how, we're showing behind the scenes a little bit in the budget to show all those transfers back and forth, as opposed to just all the money that's collected in a year, all the expenses, including capital in the year, and the net of that into a reserve, which is more what MODL would do, I think.
And I think I've heard in conversation that the program that the town uses for finances has its challenges too. Like, does
Yes.
that complicate, like, does that make it more difficult? I saw those eyes roll.
So it complicates everything equally, I'm not sure it's this particular.
Yeah, I mean, it's all levelly
Which-
complicated with the program.
Councilor Carver?
So a question I have about this whole discussion is what would make it most easy, well, for staff to do, but most easy for the public to understand and follow? I sort of like Councilor Wilson's idea. That is, I don't know what the answer is about that, but
The one, so it's not the easiest, these are not the easiest structures to segregate operating and capital and the various funding sources that we enjoy. But it keeps everyone accountable based on these various revenue streams that are very independent from one another. Because our small town, we have so many partnerships and so many funding sources that aren't necessary, and we can, it's a way for us to isolate who's paying for what and where the money's coming from. If we fire everything into the pot, suddenly you get a mix of fiduciary responsibilities from various organizations. So we can't segregate, we have to segregate gas tax or whatever the fancy name we call it now. There's a new name for it, community, there's a new name for it, but colloquially gas tax. We have to segregate that. And we have to segregate infrastructure charges because we're legislatively required to do that. So we do that, and that's logical. People want to know where their $500 a year is going. Well, we can't say it's going to fund the new rec director. It's going to fund sidewalks and infrastructure. That was always the story from the earliest incarnation of that fee. The area dividends moderated over time. Maybe they'll come back again. Hope springs eternal that the electrical utility will inevitably pay a dividend. I mean, I'm not holding my breath, but I hope I live in hope. And then it really comes down to the other wild card, which is de-transfer tax. And I just don't think we ever anticipated we were going to be taking de-transfer tax and taking it into operating. Anyway, we are where we are now, but I wouldn't want to make it that way forever. So anyway, I mean, there are pros and cons, but at least everybody can isolate it in one easy it's easy to tell someone on the street corner where their $500 is going for versus town general. I mean, I think we're all wondering about where the money goes. At least you'd be able to say, yeah, you can keep,
You break it down.
you can break it down in a logical way. So I'd be a little reticent. I think it's served us really well. I think we've had a superior structure to most
I
municipalities.
mean, let's figure I would have to narrate that a little bit better.
Councillor Carver.
So in terms of, operating costs or cutting back where we could can. So one item that, we've heard questions from the public is the increasing number of staff or employees in town hall. And just on the administrative on page 16, in that portion where salaries are allocated, it shows a 23% increase. Is that right? For 25, 26.
What page?
I'm not quite,
16?
page 16, so I'm not quite sure how to frame the question. Sometimes the public frame it as, why do we have to have so many staff? Why are these costs going up and up? So how do we answer that?
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, Kelly already spoke to this earlier, right? The council Wilson spoke to this earlier. This is about places where council has identified a strategic need for additional capacity. And that is in response to the public telling you, in most cases, that they feel you need to respond to their concerns with strategic increases in capacity. So typically, that's a narrative that comes right from the doorstep on the election campaign into the budget.
Right.
But we need to do a better job of communicating that.
Right, so communications is one example. That was a doorstep issue during the campaign. Communications, the town hall is not communicating well. We want better communication, so we hired a communication staff person, right?
Right.
Yeah, and I think on the event side, you've got that, and then you've got the housing accelerator stuff, which is funded, but represents a strategic focus on housing. Those are the two big differences. And on the finance side, we've said we need to modernize and improve our financial services, so there's some.
So when it comes to how we communicate the budget to the public, and we talked about this yesterday in the communications committee. That kind of issue could be included. Who am I? Oh, I'm not talking to you, but you're gonna be part of developing that
Yeah.
PR or communications
Yeah,
around the budget. So I think that needs to be communicated, how all those things fit together.
Yes, CEO.
Oh, wow, she's gonna.
Oh, sorry. Manager?
I know I hear it a lot too, that, we're a town of 1,000 and why do we have so much staff? And I think what is forgotten is that regardless of the size of our town, we have a lot within our town. We have 2 utilities, we have a solar garden, and we pride ourselves in, keeping up with the wants and needs of the residents and their requirements and their demands. When this storm is out, we're all plowing immediately. And in order to do that, it involves staff. And I think that, it's looking at just the town population isn't always the best assessment of our requirement to run this town because of all our arms and in all these various different areas. So that's something maybe we need to remind too.
Deputy?
Speaking of the solar garden, are we, do we, in the budget, do we pull it out as a separate entity or does it sit under the utility?
It sits under the electric utility.
Yeah, but per your request on that, when we get to the utilities next week, it is all utility costs now, but there will also be a little breakout.
Oh, right, I already asked, sorry.
Like, if you want to see the revenue and the expenditures associated with solar garden in one note, because they'll be shown on the 2 different sides, here it is as one thing,
Okay.
and with the net, value of it.
That'd be good, I think. Sorry, I forgot I asked already.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Councillor Carver.
It's interesting that you speak to the complexity that we've added through solar gardens and windmills and what have you. Those are drivers of cost without producing in any obvious way contributions back to reducing residents' costs. The revenue goes back into infrastructure developments, I guess. But we have created our own problem. In parts.
And I just want to speak to the idea that we talked a lot this morning about, I have my hand up. but
Okay, yes, sorry.
Because we talked a lot this morning about, relatively speaking, keeping the tax burden lower than other municipalities. And that's during those same years in which we're talking about making these investments. So I do think that it is fairly reasonable to substantiate that these investments have been worthwhile. Like, we haven't had cost increases during the same period that other municipalities have, and we've added the complexity. So obviously, the complexity itself is not without benefit. Like, the solar garden is actually producing at a rate cheaper than Nova Scotia Power, so that's a benefit to the utility. And I just think it's worth noting that, like, clearly there is an implication of benefit in the last couple of years of not raising rates and taxes.
It doesn't translate through to residents costs being lower.
Well, they're correspondingly lower than resident costs in Bridgewater. if you
Oh,
look at
well,
3 years
okay,
ago and today.
on a comparable basis.
Just as an aside, getting to this manpower thing, sometimes when I'm confronted with those questions, I just say to people, look, one of the big differences between now and 10 or 12 years ago is our people are out doing stuff and they're highly visible. So they may not be more of them, it seems like there are, because they're out hiding somewhere. And that's an actual fact, especially with our operating staff.
Councillor Finn, that's a good point.
So,
Yeah. Strong point.
just by way of direction, and then maybe we can move on to the rest of the agenda, because I'm sure. But on operating, I think if staff can go and find us a cent worth of cuts, so 25,000, so a cent of cuts, I think council, at some point we'd probably be willing to say, okay, if we had a half a cent of operating cuts, and we had a 1 cent cut, a 1 cent of operating cuts worth 25,000, maybe we have to talk about 112, which is another 25,000. And then that would take the reliance of the D-transfer tax from 175 down to 125. Maybe we could all live with that. I think personally that to me is a kind of a decent compromise, so that we went from a 111.5 to 111 to back to 112 under that scenario. But a version that looks something like that, I think would mean we would have less reliance on the full transfer of the D-transfer tax. I think that would be a better plan. That's just one idea, so I'm not trying to presuppose there's support on the table for that yet, but at least on the expense side, that wouldn't break my heart to see 1 cent. If you could go back and find a 1 cent worth of economies, I think 3 cents of economies is a little unrealistic based on, the work that you've already done. What do you all think?
Councillor Wilson?
But what I think is getting to Rebecca's comment earlier, slow and steady is probably the way to go.
Yeah.
I think we're looking down the barrel of a 1 cent increase every year for probably the next 4 or 5 years.
Yeah,
And we might as well get on with it.
unless we get growth, right? Unless we get a bunch of growth, which is, I know we all support that. So we need a few of these projects to come together. How's that sound?
So yeah, just on that note, so Councillor Wilson raises an interesting point for the next budget draft. Do we present the budget draft with a 1 cent increase?
This is coming from some of the wage tax increases. I think, yeah. I never go hide my head.
You said that you wanted to say?
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking for everyone to weigh in, so we'll need a clear sense, and it's not just Councillor Wilson saying that for the next meeting, but yeah, because we're bringing the next version of the budget, so we're either bringing it based on the same tax rate or a different one. And we can still go back and forth on that, it's just a draft, but.
So we wouldn't be looking at that to up spending in any of the areas you've already proposed, but maybe start paying back reserves or
Yeah,
putting it
definitely no
into
corresponding
capital for
spending increase,
surprises.
yeah.
Yeah,
Or we're not gonna increase
No,
What we're
anything
aiming
in
to
the budget if we
What we're
did
aiming
that.
to do is decrease the D transfer to operating, so
Yeah.
if there's more operating funds, then the D transfer go back to capital.
Okay,
So that would be the net effect. We've only added one expenditure to the budget since we started this process, which was the council last week, a $3,000 increase to the grants. And we get to talk very shortly about whether that's coming out of the 35,000 or whether that's in addition to. This Councillor Peavy, this was your motion at the council last week about $3,000 for pro kids equivalent. recreational funding.
Uh-huh.
So we just need to figure out if that's on top of the grants allocation or within it, and that's what we're gonna talk about.
Counselor Wilson.
So I think my math is right, a 1 cent tax increase is closer to $40,000, is that right? About $4 million.
It was more like 25.
Page at the beginning that shows how much it should be if that's accurate.
Anyway, whatever it is, I think we want to make sure that we all understand that whatever that increase is, staff is on the hook for finding the corresponding decrease.
That's what I was gonna ask, so if
Yeah, we're
we're,
basically looking for double that value
Yeah.
somehow, if we can, yeah.
Yeah.
The page that shows that is, according to mine, it says page 9, is everything on
Page
document
7.
Page 9?
Page
Okay,
7 shows that.
Sorry, every time I go to a page reference, it's page 9.
Okay, page
So at the
7.
bottom of that page, there's
Yeah.
a little thing that says 1 cent impact on revenue, so I'm assuming that 20,668 is the 1 cent impact.
Yeah.
Okay, that's it correctly, like.
Now, this could be an opportunity to look at a 1% impact on revenue, which helps address the commercial residential imbalance. That's why that's presented differently. I think this predates you, Ashley, but
yeah,
Luke always did this because he wanted to show, to Joe's point, that a 1 cent increase across the board isn't fair to the balance of commercial residential. We end up increasing the imbalance.
Yeah.
A 1% increase keeps it relative. So a 1% increase in commercial is a larger cent increase than a 1% increase in residential.
Yeah, no, fair enough.
So they're working out to the same value, but it rests more on the
Yeah.
commercial side using the 1%.
Yeah.
So maybe we could also get clarity on, do we want to reflect 1% versus a 1 cent?
Yeah, 1%.
Because 1% is definitely keeping the ratios the way they are, as opposed to making the burden shift even more towards residential. But they're still only both about 20,000.
Yeah.
And I think that, Kelly, the outside, if we do for fire, you get about 40, because if the outside area.
Okay, that's better.
Yeah, percent,
Counselor
but the
Wilson.
percent seems to make sense to me because you can correlate that to the 6% increase in police budgets and 6% in this, so you're getting away with 1% instead of 6% sort of thing. It's an easy analogy comparison.
I mean, it's more, but I guess it's relative to every other cost in the world. The other thing, as far as direction, it wouldn't break my heart, Ashley, if we had a table that we could share with council around fire. With the splits of the contributors to the fire rate, within the town general section. I think that would really help everyone see this 90-10 that I've been talking about.
okay,
And then, like, I'd propose some multi-year plan to get that into a more, a fair ratio, but to Rebecca's point, I think slow and steady is a logical way. And let's face it, hey, we could be having a lot different conversation a year from now if we have 6 different projects start rolling down the assembly line, so let's hope for growth.
Counselor Carter.
I just have an information question. When does, for a property sale, when does the effect of the losing the cap kick in to our members? Is it the following year?
The cap gets, the capped assessment would be lost immediately in the next calendar year, but the assessment increase might not kick in for 18 months. Because the base year is the year before. So the base year this year would be January 1st, 2024 would be the base year of the assessment.
So if a property sells in 2025, when do we see the
Next year.
increased assessment? And then when do we apply our tax rate based on that assessment?
following year.
Yeah, so I mean, the way I would see it is that obviously when it changes hands, the cap comes off, but it hasn't been reassessed. So the new owner is paying more taxes on that property because they're paying for the full current assessment. But then there'd be a reassessment based on the sale that would take effect for the next year. So then they would also be paying more after that, yeah. And usually it's that one which we get all the appeals on. The one that comes, because they think they got the uncapped, said they think they're done, and then it goes up further and then.
Okay, that answers the previous
Yeah.
question. Okay, good.
Good news, we were at a historical low of assessment appeals across the province this year, so
Yeah,
people have a tendency when the relative inflationary rate, the cap rate is low, then the appeals are low, and the cap rate is high, the appeal rates are super high. So we went from 18,000 appeals down to 6.5.
I assume you've shed staff accordingly.
Well, same budget, 1% increase, 1% increase in price.
Yeah,
So just a suggestion as to a motion, because we usually do get a motion on something like this, would just be the council directs staff to include a 1% increase in revenues and seek a 1% decrease in operating expenditures, or sorry, tax revenues, and seek a 1% decrease in operating expenditures in the next 25-26 budget draft. So just, there's our overall direction. Now, there's some smaller stuff we'll talk about, obviously changing, but.
And what about Joe's idea of going from 175 to 125?
Well, I think that would just happen. Like when the extra
Okay.
revenues show up, Colin, it will get,
Right, okay.
it'll get normalized in that.
Yeah, the net effect of the decreasing expenditures and
Because-
increasing revenues will be to reduction.
Because they're solving for
Right.
balanced budget.
Yeah, so
So-
you don't have to specify.
I don't
Okay.
think,
Yeah.
we're all on the same page.
Can I make that
I
motion?
guess,
Make that motion?
yes, and second by Councilor
Yeah,
Carver.
that is, Ms. Monroe.
I
Okay,
can send it to you, Kelly. if you-
and this is draft,
Yeah, this is to the draft.
yeah. Okay,
Can we get seconded?
any,
Yes,
yes, we
Penny.
did, Councilor Carver. And, any more discussion on this? No? Okay, I'll call for the question. All those in favor signify aye. Opposed, nay. The motion is carried. CAO,
So I have a presentation question for the next version of the budget, since we're talking about a new version. We talked a little bit last time about the idea of the provincial tax rate being articulated separately on bills. But I am wondering if it might be somewhat helpful to show the provincial tax rate in the presentation part of the budget where it breaks down fire and general. It just basically what it would do is it would take the percentage of general taxation, the 1.11, and show how much of that goes directly to the province. Because that is a practice that HRM and CBRM and a number of other units do. But it just helps people understand that like a fair chunk of that 111 is also, it's actually a provincial levy applied against our assessment base.
Yeah, huge, yeah.
So, you know, just thinking you could put that in more clearly for people.
Yes.
Anytime there's room for clarity,
Yeah.
let's just do it,
yeah,
you know?
Yeah.
for sure.
How much is that?
Yeah, well, we don't express it as a tax rate that way, so we'll see, but it's the education contribution is the most part of it, so it's a very large amount these days.
Last year, there was a big jump in education.
And we gotta make sure it shows that it hits mostly on the residential, because the education portion is residential based. It's not,
Yeah, I mean,
it is only a consideration of our residential assessment. So the commercial side, that levy is actually like reasonably should be seen as pulling from the residential side. Just to Joe's point about who pays the relative burden, if we were to show that hit as a purely residential rate, it would also inform the commercial residential split to the town's budget. In fact, Joe, it might offset that difference you're talking about. Like, if you think about how much the province takes based on residential assessment, if we say that the provincial tax rate is a residential rate, like, because it is only the residential assessment that is used to determine the education rate.
Mhm.
So we didn't talk about that more for the final version, but if it's presented as a residential rate, then the remaining town residential rate and town commercial rate, now the ratios have changed again and the commercial rate is paying a larger share of town expenditures. Because you essentially remove the residential revenues that go directly to the province from the equation. It just maybe worth looking at.
Mhm.
It didn't used to be such a huge part of it. Way back in the day when I was young, you'll maybe remember, Bone Bay was a net recipient of provincial funds. That has very much flipped over the years, so people maybe don't understand that.
Mhm.
Based on the relative prosperity of the community, I mean, it's a good thing.
Yeah.
But obviously, the community in the 80s was seen as being in a position to need help. And the community today is seen as being in a position to help the rest of the province, I guess you could say.
We're a half municipality.
Yeah, we are.
What did you say? Best
We're a
little,
half municipality.
best little town in Canada.
Yeah.
I think we should.
I don't know if it's one of the things on the house, but yeah, so we were we were a recipient of equalization, and now we're a have.
I'd love to see that house again.
Yeah,
When was the last one? 2019?
They released
The
one,
province is putting 21, 22 out short.
Okay.
For us.
oh,
We
Okay.
have to give it the FIR.
3 years in the rearview mirror.
it's, Do people have any questions about the capital budget that they wanted to bring up? Before we're heading towards 10:30?
Yeah, there's a certain parallel perhaps between the grants and the requests. So there were only a couple of requests in the capital budget. They're highlighted in yellow. I can tell you what page they're on. I'm not sure if anybody had a chance to review those. I try to explain to groups that some things that they're requesting are grants, some things that they're requesting are actually town spending on projects that they've asked us to spend on. So it's page 9 of the PDF, and I think it's page 9 of the printed document. And it's transportation projects, clearly from shoulder. Main
I
Street
can't tell
over.
which one is up in this, the way
I
this is
know, it's always the
stapled.
challenge with this.
Okay,
The
Oh.
digital version is so much more straightforward, but.
okay, I have numbers of like 32, 30.
I don't have any numbers.
No, there are no actual page numbers on the document, that's the problem. We'll fix it in the next version.
One that looks like this, Penny.
Yeah, thank you, Colin.
Looks like that.
Look like that.
No, there's 3 yellows in the middle.
Yeah,
And it-
All right.
Recreation, what do we?
no, they're under
Transportation,
Okay,
transportation,
found it.
transportation.
so I thought maybe it'd be a good opportunity to highlight these, because I think we talked about the last time.
Transportation, yeah.
Okay.
Right.
3 projects, they all ended up being transportation projects, just based on our asset classification, but the Clearway Street shoulder, which was a request from the school advisory committee, is that the proper SAC?
SAC,
School advisory committee, I use all the acronyms, but, and then the main over crosswalk relocation, which was a request for RPS, so I'm sure that's top of mind, because we received that at the last meeting of council. And then the Hawthorne Road secondary exit, which is a request we've received variously from the residents of Hawthorne. It's a little bit less organized because they're not an incorporated entity, but they certainly have regularly highlighted this over the past year. So those 3 things are are those things that, council has any questions or opinions on? Because those groups obviously seeing these are in the budget, would like to know if they're gonna stay in the budget, and well.
So even though the Hawthorne Road, the secondary egress is not requested by an official group, we have an official responsibility to provide for the safety of our residents. So I'm all in favor of that one.
Agreed.
Oh, Council Wilson.
Yeah, since the author Gilson is up on the table. Yes, there is a responsibility, but the legal responsibility, I think, kicks in at 25 housing units.
It's 50.
Is it 50, sorry, which I don't think we're there yet, so. I guess 2 points. One is, I'm not sure clearly. Fiduciary responsibilities, that rests with the developer. Who's got to do with it, you understand that. So it ends up in our lap. But the other piece is, I'm not really sure that an exit halfway down the hill going into Park Cemetery accomplishes very much.
And I think that's one of the key things to talk about is if it's going to require $250,000 in coordination with the Department of Natural Resources, the much better solution of going out the other end, using the road reserve parcel and down the trail, would be a better solution, but it's not one that we're going to be in a position to realize this year.
Councillor King.
So, this just seems like such a consequential amount of money to open a gate so that people in an emergency could drive off of that, out of that corridor, when really the issue was that we had a decision by a one-time decision in one situation where the fire truck parked across the lane at the railway track and wouldn't allow any cars by. And had that fire truck just moved back 4 feet, this issue never would have percolated, never would have come up. So albeit from that one momentary decision by one individual who made the decision to really lock in all the residents on the hill, this issue would never come up. When I think about the solution, the more consequential issue up there, it's around fire suppression. So fire suppression, right? It's it's about hydrants. It's about ensuring that you can get water to the top of the hill. It's about getting a pumper that would allow you to get water up there. And I just think in the hierarchy of needs, fire suppression strikes me as more important than simply putting a $45,000 gate to get across that path. Like, to be frank, if someone has to leave a car behind, like, we just want to get the people out of there quickly. I know it's a bottleneck and there's only one track, but the other path forward out towards Bobo, I would have thought we were gonna get that done for 45,000.
Yeah,
Like, we were gonna get an actual secondary corridor that was actually separate and distinct from the idea that I'm going by the Henniger's house and I'm putting a little cart path down there, that we have the two big boulders there. That we put up to limit access to cemetery. Like, I'm all for opening the corridor to the cemetery, but I thought we were just gonna get Jonathan up there with a couple guys.
Yeah.
And they were gonna put up like a gate and give everybody like a lock. I didn't think we were gonna spend $45,000 to do that.
And this is an example of how much things cost. So, Jonathan went up there to look at that, as we get boulders or whatever, but also on the other end, we've got a trail that's not actually wide enough for a motor vehicle. So he looked at the cutting back and then appropriately at gates on both ends so that people don't go in there and can't get out of there. And 2 gates and cutting it back to an appropriate width and then making sure it's safe for vehicular traffic is $45,000. Now, I mean, I agree that
Same.
you can just say, well, in the event of an emergency, people could get through there if you move those rocks with a backhoe and we can just see what happens. But if we're going to say that we've something that would have met our expectations from the developer, like we're the developer, to Councilor Wilson's point, we're the developer being required to provide a secondary access, we certainly would at minimum want them to do at least what we're talking about here. I still feel this is not a very good secondary access in that the area in question will likely also be compromised by a wildfire just and basically at the same exact time as the current street exit. So the bigger problem is it's not a very effective exit on which to spend $45,000
So
on.
will the town bill the developer for this work we're doing?
Well, that developer has passed away and it was our
But there's a
decision.
new developer.
Well, there's a new owner, but I mean, the subdivision plan was approved back in the day based on the density of the day, and there was obviously a willingness for council to accept that there would be no secondary access because there would be less than 50 dwelling units, and at this time, there still are less than 50 dwelling units, but now there's a potential for there to, like, potentially, well, we're talking about changing the zoning, which would further restrict that, so, I don't think the developer reasonably was required to do it, that was our call.
Deputy, then Councillor Wilson and then Paul.
Could we not have a 2-step process here? Because could we move the rocks and have it as like an emergency exit in case some people need it without gates and streets and widening and all this stuff? And really, I think the second egress needs to be the smarter one, which is down at the other end. This seems like a huge amount of money for moving a couple rocks and a gate. I mean, because then I look at the next line up and it's $25,000 for 6 stripes on the road, right? Like, oh my God.
Yeah.
So like what, and so that prompts my question, what's the sort of procurement strategy here? Like $25,000 to me, I was just saying to Ashley, that's shocking.
Yeah.
Is there a competitive environment in that, in painting?
It really
Sidewalks?
doesn't come down to that, because our new standards, accessibility standards for crosswalks include audio, visual and tactile indicators.
Oh,
That's
okay.
$18,000.
Got it.
So, yeah,
Done.
the painting of the stuff for that's
Okay.
covering the cost.
All clear.
Okay, Councillor Wilson, you wanna go on the list?
I guess my takeaway on all of this is we should be changing this capital item to one that reflects the need to go out down to the rail trail at Fulwood Road at whatever that cost is in an out year that reflects the likelihood of having 50 residences in that subdivision. That way we're legal, it's on the books, but it's not today.
Okay,
And
Councillor Feeney.
so, like, the overall issue around Hawthorne, which also led to the land use bylaws, we've got hydrology issues, we've got fire suppression problems, and we have one egress up and down the hill. And there's a responsibility for the town to solve some of those problems. In the hierarchy needs, in my mind, it's fire suppression is the #1 issue that needs to be resolved, and that's not 5 minutes worth of work. so the idea that we have to run another hydrant or even ensure there's sufficient pumping capacity at that one hydrant is like, that strikes me as a town issue to be resolved. It's gonna be a big ticket item. Like, I'd rather make sure we focus our attention on that issue first. And I guess I'm less enthralled with spending 45,000 on this. I think the deputy mayor was on the right track there. Let's just do something do something more modest and much cheaper.
Okay, Councillor Palfreyman, then Carver, and then Wilson again.
Yeah, I brought this up the previous week, but there's an item in here for a new sidewalk and curb on the Faubourg Road renewal, $160,000. I asked where it came from, and it's buried in history apparently, but I just don't see we need a justification for that level of expenditure for that particular area.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
Oh, so I just want to say, so one rationale around possibly delaying that, and it's a different point obviously than the item we were just talking about, but one rationale about possibly delaying that I wanted to speak in support of is we do have in the budget the development of an active transportation plan to inform pedestrian safety and sidewalk investments, and that's in this year's budget. So postponing that sidewalk investment by a year to determine its relative priority through the public process of the active transportation plan is a pretty reasonable approach. If the question is, why is that a priority?
Yeah, let's do that. Let's.
Well, I would think so, but then that raises the secondary question, not for now, is that which sidewalks get priority with that funding.
Exactly.
And that's the purpose of the
That's the
transportation
second
plan,
review.
is to determine how we would rank all that. And not just sidewalks, I mean, the same thing does apply to most road widening and road work. So, the Clearway Street shoulder has been expressed as mostly about parking, the request, as opposed to being about active transportation. But, there is still that consideration of, we don't know what the long-term objective for Clearway Street shoulder or sidewalk is,
The
because it
original,
presumably will be reconfirmed or confirmed during the active transportation plan process.
the original request for that was to allow for student foot transportation to connect to the trail originally. It wasn't about parking, it was to provide access safely to the trail for their cross-country runs, for some children travel that way by bike. A lot of kids come from Lock Coast, Clearland, whatever, Oakland, on the trail to school this time of year and in the fall. And some teachers do too. But that originally wasn't about parking at all. It was more about active transportation.
Yes,
Yeah.
but the request we have now
Yeah.
won't do anything from an active transportation perspective, it's about parking.
Yeah,
And it's been pared down from larger concepts that we're going to have active transportation benefits. And all that's left is the parking consideration. So I just want to be clear, like, it would be a lot more money than what's being requested there to achieve what you're talking about. And that was in the previous year's budget for consideration, it wasn't through.
okay.
And so the school advisory committee reduced the request. Now, it is incremental to saying, well, let's just start with level of the shoulder. And then later, that will not be a sunken cost, because anything we do to improve the side for pedestrians will be built on top of that level shoulder. But for now, we want people to be allowed to park on that level shoulder, which means it won't be available for pedestrian use, because there will be cars on it. So you can't get both, you can't widen it and say you can park on it and then say it's also an active transportation corridor, because there will be cars on it. So I just want to be clear, that price doesn't get you the active transportation corridor that was originally talked about.
Well,
Councillor
that
Carver.
certainly muddied the water for me, because I still thought that Clearway Street shoulder was for the active transportation. I hadn't registered at all that it's planning for parking.
Yeah, that's what they came and presented to council about, was the parking.
Right.
Is that going to be?
And I here we are, being bossed around by parking requirements again. I don't mean that in terms of the school, but that parking is such a dominant issue.
And again, it's because the off-street parking is insufficient, which is then leading to more on-street parking. That's the same thing we were talking about in the commercial court.
So I don't know, I'm not quite finished. So I'm not quite sure how I feel about that item at this point. But I'm also confused about the Hawthorne Hill secondary exit, where it's planned for. I've missed something along the way. Can you just briefly describe so I can understand and perhaps everybody else too?
There's a cow path, let's say, an old cow path that takes you from Hawthorne Hill behind the Henniker's house. Not Lynn's, but David and Tina's. Between their house and
Tom and Tammy
no, Bill,
open.
the Bays, close to the Bay, like in between there is a cow path and there are stones there to prevent vehicles, ATVs and whatnot from entering the cemetery.
That's,
And just for a little bit further clarity, that piece of property belongs to Bedford Lands. It's part of a sort of retained parcel of common areas. And it's supposedly available for the common use of the residents of Hawthorne to transit on a recreational basis to and from the cemetery property.
I think Penny's asking about the other exit though, at the other end, right? Not the one-
Bedford Lands,
The current development.
the current developer, okay.
But it was retained by Ian originally. It is meant to be
So
a
it's
public use access for non-vehicular use going between Hawthorne and the cemetery.
So the $45,000 is to be applied for that.
To operate it to a vehicular corridor, but then gate both ends so it can't actually be used as an emergency.
Okay, I share, while I feel it's important to have a secondary access, that I'm kind of shocked at that cost for that amount of result. And then the discussion addressed to FOBO, where would that be?
So that was, I think, what Colin was thinking you were wondering about. That is a road reserve. So when he did the original development, he was required to leave a road. He even has a name, I think it's called Rainbow Way or something like that. It's a cool name. That would go from Hawthorne through to the adjacent property between Hawthorne and Faubourg, which is a privately owned property. It's not part of the development.
Down at the other end.
But it also happens to, basically was turned over to the town to be used for future road expansion, but it also happens to abut the trail. So even if it can't continue on to the adjacent property as part of a larger subdivision development, which someday in the future in mind, that was the purpose of it, it's a requirement of our subdivision bylaw to do that. It also could afford the town a direct access from Hawthorne to the DNR trail system. So it's the same parcel would connect either to the adjacent private property or could be a connection down to the trail system. The far corner, Penny, basically the exact opposite end of the property from this discussion about Park Cemetery. And the obvious advantage from a fire egress perspective is if there's a fire on one end, the other end is where you want to be, not on the same end. So,
Exactly.
I mean, Jonathan and I really feel it's the right way to go, but we do want to say DNR has not granted permission. And we checked with Kara, who is, as you know, pretty much the go-to authority around wildfire safety, and she's now working with HRM as opposed to the province. And she said it's her understanding DNR has refused that request on other occasions. It has not, there's no precedent. So we and everyone else in the province is going to be saying, can we please build these emergency connections to the trail? Because there are lots of locations where that is the obvious emergency right.
Okay, we're at 10:30.
Oh, sorry, can, NSFM help with that advocacy? Just, you don't need an answer.
Yeah, potentially.
And what is the minimum amount that we can actually get an egress, temporary?
And one gate.
Yeah, well,
If
so.
you can't back up that well, I don't think you should ever talk to
I could ask Jonathan about trying to get this one cheaper, but if we don't think this is fundamentally a very good idea, I think, at the end of the day, we should focus on the other one. And I would say the other one, is very rudimentary, is at least $250,000.
Yeah.
If you go look at the geography, you'll understand why.
Counselor Wilson?
before we hopefully move on, I just wanted to clarify, I had a chat with the fire chief 2-3 months ago. There's absolutely no problem technically with them servicing all the houses on Hawthorne Hill right now, period.
Servicing,
Yes.
With
they could
water
put a fire-
suppression.
Yes,
Yes.
where did this urban myth come from then?
I have no idea, maybe
Mhm.
$40 million debt that the town has saved first, probably.
So,
Counselor Feeney. and
sorry,
then
sorry, Rebecca, you
Counselor
take it away.
Quantum, we're gonna cut off the discussion,
I'll-
we can continue it
I
at another time.
I think Rebecca was before me.
No,
Right?
no. she
Okay, fair
won't do
enough. I think on those transportation categories, I'm okay deferring everything except the one that has the match. If we want to proceed with Clearway, fair enough, but all the other projects I think can be deferred for the year. Like, given the breadth of our other investments and our other priorities and all of Edgewater, like, I just think we have to be realistic about building in some contingencies, so I'll be a little more reticent about spending the other 287,000. This year, Dylan, I think I would just keep those on simmer and defer them for a year. With the exception of the project that we have built, the Main Street West project, which has the large third-party grant, like, obviously proceed with that one. Because we're only out of pocket, if I understand that, for 70, we're only out of pocket for the difference between the renewal and the external number, or both of those numbers.
Yeah, no, I mean, we're only out of pocket for the difference, it's very, very small.
Yeah.
That's because we're only just doing engineering work in this year, it's not
Okay.
at this point projected to move ahead to construction, because we don't have confirmation of the largest funding sources.
Okay,
But I
and
didn't catch, sorry, Joe, did you say something about projects 4 through 9? Like, I
Yeah,
know we're talking about the
so
three request projects.
I'd prefer, this is just one opinion, but I think Brian's on the same opinion, that we should just wait till the active transportation plan is done. And we'll prioritize all the sidewalk upgrades that we're gonna do over the next 5 years. And then we'll figure out which sidewalks we're gonna do based on that prioritization. So instead of doing,
No, that
right?
makes good sense.
Like, so let's just
So
defer
4
all.
through 7, which are all just little fixes to road issues and stuff, that wasn't your contention, that's not.
No, I think specifically just the Hawthorne secondary exit, the 160,000 for Bobo. The other ones are kind of inconsequential, and then I'll leave it with you on.
And the Clearway shoulder is.
And the clear,
Yeah.
so, and then I took your point about the $18,000 overhead for the sidewalk, not the painted lines.
Yeah.
The most expensive lines.
so
So what do I,
we're gonna pave Swicker Lane?
wait,
I'm not making these changes, I'm just getting feedback, and we're out of time, so we can make the changes on a
Yeah.
further version of the budget.
Um,
But I think it's.
Counselor Toronto, you've
Okay.
waited a long time.
That's okay. Joe talked
Joe got
about it. It's
Yeah.
good.
Okay, can we switch now? We can pause this conversation. We'll make time for it another part of our discussion. Obviously, we need more time to discuss, but I'd like us to move on to the grant.
At least it takes very little staff time to make changes to the budget, I just move an item from one year to the next, so we can make those in a later version.
Okay.
and it's specific reference to the our next discussion, because I don't need it, so.
Yes, okay, we'll pick that back up, we'll rework that.
Okay, thank you.
Suzanne.
so we're going to switch over to the grant. Some of us are having problems with that document. You too? Okay, no, with
Page 53.
finding the document.
Oh.
Mine,
all this, you
mine
mean?
wouldn't open. No, I think we're going to the grant.
That's
So
the
that's
grant.
a package,
This
that's
is
the,
Okay.
different though.
yeah, the
So,
only document we're gonna want, if you want Colin's point of view.
so page
Page
53, 53,
Yeah, that's a
yeah.
document.
So those of you in TV land, it's page 53, if you printed off or you're referring to your package that was online. 53 and you're
That's right.
the monster document, as the manager fondly calls. Okay, so these are, did you want to have an opening comment?
I probably should, because,
Okay.
you know, council has set this expectation that staff provide recommendations on the award of the grant, so. We got into this a little bit with the chamber the other night, you know, it's a little hard to be asked to weigh in on all these super valid, obviously great ideas that people are working on things in the community, so. Just right off the top, we received $61,000 requests for grants. That's actually not correct. I'm still looking at this older version because we had a version control issue. So we actually received about $85,000 worth of requests for grants. And ultimately, our prior year budget for grants was 31,000. So we received obviously more than twice the applications that we could grant under that budget. Knowing that it's a relatively lean year, I did look at the bottom line and started by saying, I don't think we can support more than a $35,000 grants budget. Now, I will say there are items in here that could be construed as subsidies that may more appropriately be moved to a subsidies area of the budget. but ultimately that they will still cost. So if you take it out of here, you might want to reduce the overall grant allocation by a corresponding amount, or we'll eat up some of the discussion we just had about, finding savings and making room in the budget. So in that context, I can just kind of go down the list a little bit here.
I think just, so there's 2 points, as the CEO said, under their staffing, that the original grant was 25,000, not 2,500.
Grant requests.
Grant request, and then there was a $3,000 grant, that Councillor Feeney proposed last.
Yes, so one of the key questions that he's reminding me is whether we are trying to accommodate within the 35,000, which is not accommodated in this version, a $3,000 allotment for recreational grants that was approved at last week's council meeting, earlier this week's council meeting, thank you. Actually. So it would be 38,000 if that's an addition, or we need to reduce these amounts. I think since we're doing a new budget draft, as long as council's clear on which one you want, we'll take care of that. But if I can, I'll just quickly go down the amounts, because for the most part, what you'll see is even if people requested more than they received the previous year, the recommendation is generally to stay at the amount that they had been receiving in the previous year. There are a couple of small exceptions to that, but just wanted to call attention to that because that would be the case with the Mahone Bay Music Association. They received 3,000, they requested 4. The recommended allocation remains at 3. That would be the case with the chamber. They requested 25,000. They previously received 2,500. The suggested allocation remains at 2,500. For the most part, that is the methodology. But the big thing dominating this year's grant request really is these large requests from Mahone Bay Center, Mahone Bay United, and the Chamber of Commerce. And I will say that while Mahone Bay United clearly is making a request for specific capital spending items, the other 2 are requesting general operating subsidies. Hence my point about whether they might better be construed as subsidies going forward. So all that being said, I can answer questions about why I might have recommended something specific for a specific grant application, if you guys have or have not had a chance to review them. And ultimately, it's now yours, so if you want to move one up, move another down, change the final amount.
Okay.
It's at your discretion at this point.
So the very dark black, 20, 24, 25, those are last year, right? So
Yeah.
we're just using that for comparison.
The far right-hand side is the recommended amount.
What you're recommending, so the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 items?
Yes, yeah, that's a way to look at it as well, is that we
Okay.
would have 11 separate distinct recipients of the grants based on this recommendation. As opposed to about 15 applicants,
Okay.
plus pro kids.
plus the programs.
Plus, we usually leave 3,000-ish for grants.
I didn't include leaving anything in the 35, so if you want to
Okay.
do that, that's another 3,000.
Yeah, something to consider, the
Yeah.
council typically.
Okay.
There were too many good requests to suggest we just reject them and save $3,000, so that's something for council to consider.
Correct. Okay.
So I thought, sorry.
Yes.
Yeah.
Council Carver, so
I had my hand
gotta
up.
start my new list.
So the third item down, the MBTC flower baskets. The request was there, but in the meantime, the decision has been made to fund that project differently.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, it's a good point, Councilor Carver, another type of request. So we talked about the idea that some groups request we spend money on a capital project, and some groups request we give them money, but also some groups have requested the town take on the provision of certain services, and that then becomes an operating expense in our budget rather than a grant, because we would be the ones paying to do the flower baskets from now
And
on.
can we identify what page we'd find that, because it's a bit more than,
So flower baskets one's gonna end up in the note about public works staff,
Yes.
depending on council's final decision around that. So
Right.
what we would say is this flower baskets grant has now become a service that the town is providing. So maybe we want a little note on the grants to show we haven't abandoned it, we've actually increased our support.
And I think
Yeah.
that's important to
Yeah,
make that
yeah,
point. Thank you.
so,
Because that's great.
okay. Council Wilson,
I'm just wondering why we are giving money to the Kidney Association.
I think we're not.
Not this
Yeah,
year.
That's a request.
oh,
Yeah, so the requested column, they request $800,
Yeah.
the final on the right-hand column.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm suggesting not, yeah, there were a bunch of those,
No,
I'm
I
sure
just,
they're all good causes.
no, I got in the wrong line, I'm sorry.
Yeah, there were a whole bunch of those. I guess I'll note on that the reason that the 55 plus Lunenburg County games and that request is, the reason that I'm suggesting that we support that is because it is very much expected that the units in the county will be contributing, and I do believe we would be the only ones not contributing, so something to consider. But ultimately, that request is much like the others. It's not a Mahone Bay group doing a Mahone Bay thing.
And that makes sense in terms of priority.
That's very, that's just mentioned pretty much. So.
Yeah. Councillor Pulverman?
Yeah, I just wonder about, that, I agree with the 10,000 of the Mahone Bay Centre Society, because that's an issue that's been around for a while, and we know the background to that and so on and so forth. But whether it fits in this category or not, I'm not altogether clear. It seems to be something more like, where we subsidize, taxes or.
And that was my point, is we're having to move it
Yeah.
over to the subsidies
Yeah.
line, but then that would still leave a $10,000 hole in this. Like, we're still gonna have to spend the $10,000, so the final version of the budget maybe should reflect it not as a grant and as a subsidy, but it's still the same $35,000 pot, so if we move it, do we wanna reduce the grant pot by 10,000?
Well, I would say
Maybe.
reduce it,
Okay,
sorry, I can finish, I reduce it by somewhat with that rationale, but on the other hand, when I read what their application was for $1,000, it seemed a pretty good proposition. It involved all the kids and.
And that's really all I had
Yeah.
to say about that, was if we're giving them 10,000 base operating, presumably they could divert 1,000 into that program, and that becomes their own decision.
Well, but nevertheless,
I'm just explaining why I put it, you're free to advocate for that.
the message is that it's a good source. So if you were to move the 10 elsewhere, and all you're giving back, you're reducing the 35 by, let's say 9, gets you the 1,000 for this particular project that they had.
Yeah, and so that'd be 1,000 net increase, and then also the 3,000 that we've added from the last council's motion. So yeah, that would be a net 44,000
Yeah.
increase.
The manager and then Wilson?
I just wanted to comment that $10,000 grant request is also requested for 5 years. So if
Yes.
it is a
Yeah.
subsidy, we need to also make the decision on whether we would provide it over the next 5 years or not.
Precisely, and that's why I
Yeah.
think it belongs
Yeah,
elsewhere.
absolutely.
Further definitely makes it more akin to the subsidies.
Yep.
So that will show up in our
Well,
final.
I guess, well, let's see if we're feeling it should be in the budget, but then yes, if it's in the budget, I think the general sentiment is it probably shouldn't be in this line.
Okay,
So this 10,000, oh, sorry.
Councillor Wilson, and then you, and then Carver again, okay?
I just wanted to make sure this 10,000 is in addition to the 10,000. Or whatever it is now for taxes.
Yes, it would be.
Tax refund.
Yes.
That was my question.
Yes, oh, okay. Okay, so, Councillor Wilson, okay, Councillor, anything more, Councillor Fano?
So then they would be getting 20,000 for
They
the
actually get
next,
14,500 for the tax write-off one, and just 2 pages later in the document. So they'd
For
be
the
getting
property
20, they'd be
tax?
getting out 25.
and then one of those would be for 5 years.
Yeah,
without
because the
having
tax
to be-
exemption is in the bylaw, so it's effectively permanent, so the 10,000 would be for 5 years.
Councillor Carver?
So if that $10,000 for the Mahone Bay Center that's listed on that page comes off because it's in the subsidies section, that clears $10,000 of the 35,000.
Well, no, that was my discussion with Brian, because the budget would still be net up $10,000, so Brian's suggestion was we do net $9,000, so that we'd have $1,000 left in the grants. We would still release the grants budget by $9,000.
Or plus 3 for
Yes.
secondary application.
I'm not quite following, but I'll get an explanation later. Thank you.
Councillor Keen?
So the decision, so this is an operating subsidy. This isn't a contribution towards a capital
Yeah,
initiative.
that's the request. is for
Okay.
operating.
So that, this is a new precedent. Many councils over 20 years have had this conversation many times about the Mahone Bay Center and about funding them for with an operating subsidy. This is the first time that will ever have occurred. It really gives me a lot of pause. I'd be very aware. I just think we're in a whole different game once we start subsidizing the operating expenses versus making a $10,000 annual contribution to a capital project. which has historically been the vehicle that the town's taxpayers support the Mahone Bay Center. And so I'm always a little reticent about using the power of the municipal government's taxation to tax residents and then allocate it over to charitable pursuits that they could otherwise make directly under their own accord. But if this is really the cost of doing business to prop up the utility, because otherwise they would stop being a utility customer to the detriment of the town. If that's essentially the grand bargain, like I can live with that, but I'd rather have it, if the deal's 5 years, I'd rather keep it in grants so that it will be there for 5 years. Once that item gets put on the other page, on subsidy page, it'll be there for decades. And it will never, ever stop. And then it'll be and then it will continue to increase, which is fair enough. All I'm suggesting is that this is a change of policy. It's a change of our, covenant, social covenant with MBC. I can live with it, but I hope we're not going to hear a year from now, oh yeah, we're putting up the solar panels and we're walking away from utility. I'm hoping that noise is ended by this contribution.
Councilor Wilson?
Oh, a couple of things. One, they always used to come to council back in the day and ask for a capital grant, and we would not pay an operating grant.
Right.
And at some point, we said, I think I made the motion, was to forgive them their taxes, which is essentially an operating grant.
Mm-hmm.
But the grand bargain was go away and leave us alone. Do not come back. And I'll be quite frank, this whole thing leaves a bad taste in my mouth, this business, if you don't play ball, we're gonna put up solar panels and we'll do some damage to the electric utility. There's something, I would love to sit down and have a chat with the people that are on the board that are responsible in this area. Guess it's Jeff Bradley.
No, Norman wanted and Terry.
Yeah, we had a good chat with Mark and Terry. I mean, they articulated that this really isn't something that they would like us to see as directly, relative to the electrical thing. I mean, that was something that wasn't officially raised.
We need that in writing. I
Yeah,
would say.
so do you want to speak to it? I mean, I'm just speaking to it.
When I consider, the services that the Mahone Bay Center offers our town, if really we should have a recreation department, an active recreation department with staff, and we do not provide that anymore to our citizens. But the Mahone Bay Center does house a lot of those types of activities that we otherwise would pay a lot more for. And I think we really need to consider, because that facility has taken a big weight off town responsibility than other municipalities. And, we were paying a full-time staff, we were having summer staff, and we no longer have those responsibilities.
I agree.
But anyway, I'm
But-
open to more discussion.
I can live with it, with the acknowledgement that this is something new. But I also think there needs to be a recognition, like, let's not have historical revisionism. The deal was, if you don't give us $10,000, we're putting solar panels on our roof and we're gonna decouple from the electrical utility, which would have a fairly dramatic negative impact on the utility. So fair enough, like, we're all big boys and girls. I mean, like, you can speak plainly about it. That was where the 10,000 came from. So like, I'm all for, like, let's just not lose everything in the context of altruism. If this is the cost of maintaining that customer for our electric utility, it's economically in the community's interest, which is really our responsibility to ensure that that happens. So if the bargain is, here's $10,000 a year, you're going to continue to be an electrical utility customer rather than going and putting a solar panel on the roof, if that's the deal, I can live with that. Let's shake hands and move along. But I also would like to make sure that there's some practical paperwork to that effect, so that a year from now, we're not revisiting the topic again. And what do you all think?
You want a motion for that, or?
Well, I think it's in the hands of the CAO to handle it, but I have every comfort. I don't think we should confuse this as anything more than it absolutely is. This is a customer retention payment for the utility. That's what this is.
Otherwise known as a bribe.
It's cost of doing business, so
But
I'm
that
prepared to
doesn't-
move
I mean,
on.
that doesn't change the points made about the value of the services.
Yeah,
provided
no,
by the
no,
center, so-
I don't begrudge the team for doing it. Like, don't get me wrong, I think fair enough, ask away, and I'm sure we'll approve.
Also a problem.
We'll sleep on it. Is what it
I have
is.
no problem with the 10,000, the reasons that you, the mayor articulated well enough. The fact of the matter is that, as a result of COVID and what have you, the revenues of the centre came down as they have done for many places. And this is, what I would call a transition. Now, before they came to us, they looked at how else they could plug the hole. And, so they looked at the hydro thing, and then they said, well, perhaps we should talk to the town first before we do this. And we did, and the hole has to be plugged. So if the centre is going to continue to exist, and it's a major asset to the town. So I think it's a perfectly reasonable expenditure. And I agree that it should be, let's say, it's a contractor arrangement. This is for a period of 5 years. And who knows where the world will be by then.
Right.
I'd certainly recommend if we accept it, we should be signing an agreement that says that it has a specified duration. I just don't know, how that relationship to the question of whether they would explore, alternate energy sources, like that's perhaps more of an agreement that happens at the level of the executive and the council, as opposed to the written agreement around the grant. But that's something we can work out. I guess what I'm looking to find out this morning is what stays in the budget here. So is there a need to go down line by line for the approvals, or are there? That obviously jumped out as a sensitive item.
Yeah.
And maybe we do need to make a motion that a $10,000 subsidy to Mahone Bay Center will be reflected in the draft budget, like just so that we're clear that that is something everyone supports. Because it would be a subsidy now, I guess, or, so there's some question there. But the bigger question is, what about the overall grants allocation? And particularly for the groups that asked, are there any we should wait on telling them, hey, actually, we can approve this grant? Because we're certainly getting asked, I guess particularly Mahone United, because they have capital work, but the capital work is starting.
Nice.
Councillor Copeland.
Well, I'm okay with what's being proposed, except I'd like to see that, because of what it is for, that's Mahone Bay Centre $1,000 grant, because the program they're proposing is significant.
There's an extra 1,000, you mean going there? Okay,
Oh, sorry, Brian,
And
you
it's
mean
for a
the other
Yes,
project.
yes.
Yeah.
okay.
So essentially, we're at 40,000, including Pro Kids, with a modest amount of leftover for the inevitable late breaking Bebu request, Home Bay. There'll be something else, right? That'll always come. Inevitably, the Legion will want their $200 for their levy. And there'll be a few other odds
So
and
this
ends.
proposal is, we
40.
increase for the Mahone Bay Center $1,000 request. We increase for the $3,000 approval from council meeting, and we leave that last 1,000 as
Unallocated.
unallocated grant. And we're at 40,000, so in the next
Yeah.
version, although we know we will have room, because we're doing some changes that will create room, $5,000 of that created room is now going to increase the grants budget.
Yeah.
Deputy?
It's nothing, there's the request for Mika is 1,000 and then the grant is 1,100. I don't know if that's just a typo.
Yes, that's right. It is a request for
Oh,
1,000.
Yeah, it's definitely, it's just a typo.
So
It's nothing.
I'm writing the press release now. Although town council increased tax rate by 1 cent. That's in large part to fund the ongoing subsidies. This is a cent, right? This is half a cent of tax base. Yeah, these are big numbers compared to the good old days. That's for sure. 40 grand a year in grants. Wow, that is a big number. Used to be 10,000 not that long ago.
Councillor Carter.
So I'd just like some more information about the Blue Nose Coastal Action Foundation. The application has been received for $5,500 in kind, and can you tell us more about that?
Well, the applications are in the package. I know people have difficulty accessing it. I can bring it up and speak to it. I'm not super prepared to speak to the contents of that application, but I'll bring it up here.
Thank you.
I think, if I may,
Yes.
it has to do with the community garden.
Yes, I believe it did, yeah.
Oh, okay.
And like I said, there's lots of great applications. It's just a question of how much we have to go right now.
So that is not going to be in kind?
So my suggestion was that we are providing in-kind support. We should note that regardless of its monetary request, they even specify, like, we're working with town on this and we're asking Public Works to move earth around and like, so we would do all that. It's just they need to keep fundraising for the cash side of it is my recommendation. But as to what they were thinking they do with the cash, I think it's just building out the garden, like it's the capital associated with that.
Okay.
So kind of get the actual dollars out because it's so
Great.
Council Finn?
Mayor, so the only other thing I can think of is non-tax revenues. So fees, and other charges that the town charges for the variety of services that we provide. So this view has the new cemetery rates, which are a little bit higher, more commensurate with our cost structure. But what about, I noticed, Dylan, we're now into the maintenance mode of the chargers. So we've gone from, we put in brand new chargers, they never broke, they work perfectly well, but now they're getting aged out a little bit. We're starting to have some repairs, there's a repair budget in there. Like, how do you review periodically the rates we charge for those types of things?
It's a great question, because, where does this come up in here? It is general rather than electrical, so I think you actually have reviewed and determined that we should probably be increasing the rates. St. John Energy did an experiment with this, they started the rates the same as ours, they increased the rates by $1. There was no change in usage. I don't believe there would be any change in usage. I generally feel we could easily increase the rates by $1 to remain competitive and cover costs, so. If council wants to consider that, I wouldn't necessarily worry too much about reflecting higher revenue in the budget. But generally, it would be a good thing to do, and if you make the motion now, we can look at changing the revenue projection in the budget, but.
I think that,
More significantly, it would be about actually changing the number on the machine and getting that approved.
so we have, for the first time, I believe, an actual maintenance budget for the chargers. It wouldn't break my heart if we had an incremental revenue to come of that amount. It was a nominal amount, just, I guess the point is like, okay, so I'm happy to make that motion to ask staff to come back with a price, whatever we charge now, which is my depth on what that is and what the new price should be to cover those maintenance costs.
Another consideration is, I think the Mahone Bay Center one takes the most damage. We may want to talk about whether there's a need for some change to its configuration.
Okay, Council Falcon?
So I missed all this introduction of this service.
It was a big jump.
So why do we own them? They are flow meters. Don't they
No, we
belong to flow?
directly own them, so all of the municipal electric utilities in Atlantic Canada went to NRCan for 50 cents to buy a bunch of small slow chargers, these chargers, chargers. And deploy them in our territory, so we all operate them ourselves. So
What's flow got to do with this?
So Flow's just a vendor, they provided the service that people pay through that then remits money back to the town. They just provide that service, we contract them to basically operate the software.
Okay.
Generally Flow charges, so they're not operated by Flow directly, they're just a vendor.
Okay.
So, on the grant side then, people are drifting away, we are at the end of the time, so, I was hoping we get a motion to approve the grants budget at $40,000 with requested grants approved, like included, so that we could tell people. It seems like that's where we ended up, I don't know if there's a consensus around that, but we'd like to do it vote.
All right, make that motion.
Does that include that 1,000
Yes.
that you were, okay, all right,
Yeah, let's look at that.
who'd like to make that motion?
Oh,
Okay.
Councilor
Oh, sorry.
Fon-
Sorry.
I'll second you.
Okay.
I wanted to second.
We'll let Councilor Fulkerman make the motion and seconded by Councilor Quano. All those in favor signify aye, opposed nay. The motion is carried.
And this is
We don't
not
have
just for the
questions.
draft, this is for the final version.
Final.
This is now in the
Yes.
final, so I can be healthy. Just
And
want to make sure everybody's on the same page. We don't do questions.
No
we just
questions,
say-
okay, so thank you for joining us, those of you on YouTube, and I'm trying to find my agenda here amongst all my papers, because we are going to go into closed session, so I will entertain a motion to go into closed session for MGA 20 acquisition, sale, lease, and security of municipal property. MGA 22-2C personal matters. MGA 22-2E contract negotiations, and MGA 22-2G legal advice eligible for solicitor-client privilege. And would someone like to move that motion?
I move.
Councilor Wilson moves, second by Deputy Mayor. All those in favor signify aye. Opposed, nay. The motion is carried. We will now go into closed session, and we will